how I started for the first time when I was 13. I read about anarchist philosophy, and I didn't understand it at all. I didn't really grasp it, but I was like, well, that kind of makes sense. You know, it kind of makes sense that we don't really necessarily need people to tell us what to do in order to live peacefully and successfully.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophie, and with Ma Puce à l'Oreille, we explore how to activate communities for the planet, where people live in harmony with nature and care for each other. And I meet inspiring people to hear about their vision and discover their gift to the world. And together we'll dive into the challenges we face in the world and potential solutions. So today I am honored to have David Croisant with me. I hope it's like the right pronunciation.
Yeah.
David Croisant, and a special guest that was recommended to me by Nicolas in my first interview, and that I got to meet in a couple of occasions here. And so Nicolas recommended me to you because you to me because you were a big inspiration for her, and I understood why, because I found that you were a brilliant mind and very knowledgeable in many different topics. You've been working with open source and freedom-based tools for a long time, and you're generously helping people to in the community to regain their sovereignty with technology. And currently you're working with Start9
Yep.
to develop some home servers for people to take back control on their data.
Mm-hmm.
You're also big into Bitcoin, you're an anarchist, a student of natural law, self-defense master, you're a vegan, you're a gardener. What an interesting profile. So welcome, David.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's quite the intro. I don't think I've ever had an introduction like that before.
Really?
Yeah, that covered all the bases, it seems like.
Yeah? Well, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, it's very similarly, but I would forget about half of that.
Really?
so it's nice to have it all written down, I guess, or remembered, or brought to me.
Yeah, well, you have a lot of interesting things to share, and I think we'll need more than one interview to cover all that.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see how that goes. But we also have Loki with us. I forgot to introduce Loki. So Loki is like your best friend.
Yeah.
So we're happy to have Loki with us as well. So before we get into all these topics that I have so many questions for you, I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about who you are and your background. And I talked a little bit about all the hats that you can wear, but if I forgot any.
If you forgot them, I'm probably going to forget them too. Well, I mean, everybody's story is a long one, so I guess I'll just give a couple of basics. I was born in England, northeast of London, and I moved to the States when I was 3 years old. And I sort of, I was always a little bit slightly different, I guess, in a way, because I had a little bit different upbringing, and when I came here, my sister had schooling in England, which is a little bit different, so they put her in early. And even though I had never been to an American school or a British school, they put me in early as well. So I was always a year younger than everyone else, and so that probably had some kind of an influence on me. And then I got into technology really early, and I basically, my family would find like a computer at a garage sale for almost no money that was, already starting to age, and they'd bring it back, and then I would essentially, no one knew how to use it, so I would basically play with this thing and break it, and then the only way to use the thing again was if I figured out how to fix it. And so that's kind of how I got started with computers, was just having to break them and learn how they work in order to put them back together again, otherwise I wouldn't get to use it anymore. So that's kind of how I got into technology, and then after a while people started to realize that I knew something about how the computer worked or how to fix a problem, and so they'd ask me, friends and family would ask me to help them with theirs, and that kind of started me down this path of being interested in educating people via technology. And then the other kind of big component is that I had relatively early access to the internet, and sort of would go off on all the different little rabbit holes that there were. And at the time that was kind of difficult. Like today, there's search engines, and you can just plug in a search term and find, tons and tons of pages on how to do whatever it is, or learn about whatever it is. But at the time, you would have to kind of seek out these things, and so it was a lot more difficult. But I would find all these interesting corners, and that's how I started for the first time when I was 13. I read about anarchist philosophy, and I didn't understand it at all. I didn't really grasp it, but I was like, well, that kind of makes sense. It kind of makes sense that we don't really necessarily need people to tell us what to do in order to live peacefully and successfully. And so it kind of rang true for me, but I didn't really understand it until maybe 7 years later when I was around 20. It started to make a lot more sense, and I started getting more involved with activism and seeing how we could make that work in the world.
We'll get back to Anarchy a little bit later, but first let's start with technology.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have studied all these things related to technology, what do you see is the biggest challenge with technology today?
I think often it's like some things are made overly complex. It's you can go as far in as you want to, as far as like learning how a computer works, but what you really want to do is you want the computer to do whatever task it is that you're trying to accomplish, and so that's the thing that you need to learn. So for example, you have your gear, your equipment for your microphones, your videos, that you need to understand how they work so that you can put your podcast together. And someone else might need to use a spreadsheet because they want to track their financial history and things like that, and do budgeting. So you need to understand the tool you need to understand the outcome that you want to create in order to know the tool that you need to understand, and then you can master that tool. And not everybody has to master every tool, and not everybody has to even investigate every tool or understand how to code or understand how to do things under the hood on the command line and things like that. So I think it's more important to help people realize what it is that they want a machine to do, and then show them how that machine can do that for them, and how they can get proficient with it.
So the challenge would be, from what I understand, to help people realize that they don't need to go so complex, but just to focus on the tools that they really need, and try to work around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the other thing is it can be very intimidating, especially with a new tool. But I have no formal training of any kind. I kind of taught myself, and I think I'm not particularly different than anyone else. So I think that anyone can learn a tool on their own time. It obviously helps if you have someone that knows more about the tool already, but we have the benefit of the internet now. Even if you don't have a connection, you can go to the library and you can learn from people who have mastered it already and put content out on how to become proficient.
And so it's a little bit related to what you do every day with Start9. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit more about what is the work that you do about and what for?
Yeah, so the big broader term meta project is to rebuild the internet and computer systems into an owner-operated model, is what I like to say, which is we own all of the hardware, and we can eventually own all the networks as well. And the place that Start9 decided to begin with that is with an operating system specifically for servers. And what that means is a server is a place that you go to get data or to use a software program on the internet. So instead of using someone else's, which is what we traditionally do, this makes it easier for people to use their own and store their own stuff and keep their own data instead of having to hand it off. And so what I do...
Do you have an example of what kind of data we're talking about?
So for example, the most, probably one of the most used is photos. Most people have a camera on their phone these days, and they might like to take some pictures. And typically the first place that those pictures will go will be to an iCloud or a Google Drive or something like that. When in reality, the only reason that people don't store those photos on their own devices is that it's been made intimidating, and it's made easier to put them somewhere else. And there's benefits that come with that, backups and things like that. And what we want to do is make it easy enough for people to have all those same features without having to give that data away. So with family photos and things like that, that may be not so sensitive and people might not mind giving that away, but when you come to things like documents, health records, things of this nature, those are things that you might want to keep more private and keep to yourself and then share selectively, so health records with your doctor, for example, instead of keeping them with a third party. The other problem with everyone putting everything in one place is that that becomes what's known as a honeypot, which is a big target for someone that's interested in stealing data, for example. They only have to go to one place, as opposed to if we're all storing our own stuff, they have to go all over the place in order to find it.
I see. And how do you see it evolving over the years with what you do with Start9? What's the next steps? Like right now, it's already available. We can already have a home server and already store some of the data, but is there still some developments that need to be done? And where is it headed?
Yeah, definitely. So right now we're sort of, this is an exciting year because we're kind of getting to some sort of really important features that bring us on parity with what people are used to using, such as automated backups, which are off-site, and using fast networking like we're used to visiting websites and things like that. Right now we're using some stuff that's a little bit more rudimentary and unreliable, although it works. And so this year, by the end of the year, we'll be able to cater to content creators and small businesses so that they can host their own websites, which is a really big deal. They can host their own payment processor so they don't have to pay a third party in order to receive payments for things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And they can host their own cloud, essentially. This is what a server is, really, is your own cloud. So you can host all your documents. If you have a small business, you can host a chat server that's internal, and you don't have to depend on a third party or pay. The subscription fees for some of these services are starting to get really high. So if you're a small business that uses like Slack, for example, that can get very expensive. In this case, you can buy a device one time, you own it, and you'll be hosting your own chat server, your own cloud, your own storage, all that stuff, without having to pay a third-party subscription fees or trust them with your data. And we'll be sort of in that position where we can offer that to those kind of groups by the end of the year. So that's really exciting. And then moving into the slightly midterm, we want to get into networking. So once we have all these individual devices, we have these small businesses and these communities and these households that have their own data now, we want to be able to, for those groups to connect or federate with each other. And in that case, they wouldn't have to depend on the one connection coming in and out of the house with the ISP, so they don't have that centralized connection problem anymore. ISP is an internet service provider.
Oh, yeah.
So that would be your cable company or your phone company usually that provides the connection to your house. So in this case, we would want people to be connecting with their neighbors, and then there's, even in the event of internet outages and things like that, or censorship or attacks, people will still be able to connect in their local regions.
Yeah, that's crazy that we could have everything back into our hands in a very short term. And so everything is open source, right? Everything that you do is open source. Can you explain what open source is?
Yeah, so I like to equate open source with recipes, like cooking recipes. So for example, if you have a recipe for making some cookies, then you'll have that all written down, and it might be something that your grandma shared with you, for example. And you might like to change that recipe a little bit by putting some more sugar or less sugar, or changing the ingredients in some way. And open source is the same thing, except instead of a written down recipe in English, it's a recipe that's written in code in order to build a program. And so all the code for our operating system is open source so that the community can they can view that code and make sure that it's not doing anything malicious, like running some spyware on your computer, for example. They can also change that code, and they can make contributions to it and changes as they like, and then they can present them back to us, and we might include them. And if we don't, then you can run it yourself the way that you like to run it. So you don't have to necessarily run the code exactly as we have it. We've made it available for people to kind of change how they'd like if they had the skill to do that.
So is that what you call also FLOSS, free libre open source software? What's the difference between all that? Because we hear about It's important to use open source software, to use software that respect your privacy, your sovereignty, softwares that are libre, free.
Yeah.
You know, like there's all these terms, and all of them are for different purposes, and it's hard to understand like what do you really want to look at when you're trying to find tools for what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are endless arguments on the internet about what is open source and what is Libra and what is free, and so that's kind of a rabbit hole on its own, and there's a whole series of different licenses that kind of lay out the different ways that you can use that. And so generally open source means that at least at minimum, it means that the source code, that recipe for the code, for the program, is available for folks to look at. And that's kind of the bare minimum. It's in the public. So you can see it, you can understand it, or if you don't understand how to code, you could pay someone who does to look at it for you, so on and so forth. And then the way that I understand it, and I'm sure there's probably dictionary definitions online that might be slightly different, so I might not be exactly correct here, but typically to me, free is sort of a part of that. You have that freedom to take that code, use it how you want, and modify it and make the changes and use it for yourself. And then the Libra is more of you can kind of do anything. You can use that you can even sell that code if you make a little change. The one difference in our license that some people nitpick about is that we ask people not to build a business on the code that we've written. So everything else as far as personal use is completely allowed by that license.
You mean with Start9?
For Start9, yeah. And some people argue that that's not 100% of the way there or whatever. I tend to agree with that, actually, and I think we should go to a fully free license at some point, and it's likely that we will. But for the time being, the idea is to kind of keep large companies from looking at that code, taking it, putting $10 million in marketing in it, and then selling the product and making us go out of business is the idea behind that. So, but like I said, that could be a whole podcast on its own, and there are actually several. We even did our CEO, Matt, did a 3-hour podcast just on licenses.
Wow.
So it's a hotly debated topic.
So if people want to know what type of software they're looking into when they're looking for a tool, they should look at the license. So they go on GitHub or some kind of platform where the source code is available, and then they look at the license there, right? And then they can see if it's like open source, lib, or whatever.
Yeah, and generally, you know, if it's there's several big open source licenses. MIT and GPL are two of the biggest ones. But generally, if the code is there and available, then it almost, you know, that's the source is available already. So that's kind of the starting point. If it doesn't have a publicly hosted repository like GitHub or there's a bunch of others now, GitLab and GitT. If it doesn't have that to begin with, then the code's not typically is not available at all, and you would have to go to the company and ask them, you know, are you considering making this open source or not? And so a lot of companies will keep it completely closed and try to protect it for competitive advantage, basically.
I see. And so, is it important to look at privacy tools? Are you into that as well?
Yeah, definitely.
Why is it important?
So for me, what I really hope is that one day that our tools will come private by default, kind of in the same way that when you go into your home, when you shut the door behind you, you kind of expect that someone's going to knock, you know, before they walk in. And maybe that's not the same with your friends because you have some unspoken agreement or you know that they're coming over or whatever. But in general, the things that happen in your home are typically private to you. And I want to get to the point that computers are the same way. It should be when you're on your computer, it should be expected that everything on there is yours and it's for your eyes until you decide to share that out. And right now that's really not the case. As soon as you turn your computer on, it's often connecting to the internet, and especially with like Windows and Mac software, it's just sending all kinds of data back and forth to these other companies. And you know, sometimes it's because they're trying to make the code better and they need the data on how people are using it, but that can be easily abused. And so I would prefer that it was easy for people to provide that data anonymously if they choose to, rather than it just being taken by default without without really, you know, I mean they do ask to an extent because they give you the 100 pages terms and conditions, in terms of server end user license agreements and all this stuff. And so, you know, in that way, it is a voluntary contract. If you purchase the device, they expect you to read and understand that, even though it's not really, you know, practically.
Who does that?
Practically, no one does it. So, it would be nice if those were much simpler or didn't exist at all, and then it was expected that the device respected your freedom and privacy from the get-go, and then that you could share data as you chose from there.
So that links us to the other stuff that you're doing, which is pretty interesting and amazing, because you're really skilled at making complicated stuff into simple stuff. So you help communities to transition to freedom-based tools and sovereignty tools.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that we did together not too long ago, where you organized a workshop with Digital Independence Lab,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Is the name of it, which is a group that you started. What is
Yes.
it, and what can you tell more about what you do?
Yeah, so it's kind of an iteration. I've been running meetups of some kind in this area for, I don't even know how long now, maybe 6-7 years at least. And sort of, one will start up especially around some hot topic often, and then it'll go for a while and it'll kind of fade away, and then it'll kind of fade into a new one. It'll be a lot of the same people, some new people, with maybe slightly different topic, but always revolving around technology and education. And so this almost is what all of those have led to, because this is kind of a group that's a little bit more generalized, freedom and technology and training and hands-on workshops. So I'm kind of glad that that's worked out the way it has.
And so we had a workshop where you helped us to de-Google our phones.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty interesting. I realized that it was actually pretty simple to do it, but there were like just these little steps that I would have not guessed, and that was really helpful to have you support us in that process of removing Google from our phones and installing some other open source privacy respectful tools on it. So really grateful for that. Do you plan on expanding that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like to do things that people want, because if I just try and say, well, I want to do this thing, and if people want to join in, they can, and it tends to be not so popular. But when people, you know, I have several people ask for one thing, like getting the Google operating system off the phone, then it makes it a lot easier on me, because I can say, oh, okay, great. Everyone that wants to do that, let's pick a day, and then we can just do it. And so I really prefer it when it's driven by the community rather than by myself. And that's kind of, I think that's a method of decentralization in a way, because you can react to whatever it is that people are looking for, instead of having to come up with something and, you know, like a top-down curriculum type of thing is a little bit less popular, probably more imposing.
So now let's take a step back a little bit to look at the world in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to hear what's your perspective on the issues and challenges that we face in the world, and what you think is challenging as a human species, and what we're experiencing now, or we might experience in the future. And
Yeah.
it's like a broad question,
It
but
is,
it's interesting to see like what you're concerned about in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that we're just still maturing as a species. I think we're still kind of, maybe not in our infancy, but we still act childish in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to like resources and things like that, even though the world is abundant and there are, you know, enough of essentially everything for folks to live luxurious lives, really. But we haven't figured out how to share that yet. We haven't figured out how to live together without, you know, peacefully. And so that's what I think the biggest issue is to just growing up. And the reason that I kind of came to this conclusion that we're still kind of adolescent at best as a species is that I was well into my 30s before I realized that I was still an adolescent, mentally and emotionally, and it took me a long time to kind of come to that realization, and I feel like I've only just realized that and started to like work on myself. And so I started to realize that a lot of the things that I see in the world that bother me are things that I have, um, as problems within myself, and that I think if I could develop myself and fix some of those problems, that we could develop those things as a species and fix a lot of the same problems that we have on a larger scale.
What kind of things?
So, uh, like ego, greed, jealousy, things that we all have, and things that maybe are incurable, but they are things that we can control or understand better and live with harmoniously instead of fighting against. And mostly fear around, especially like I was talking about resources, fear of not having, fear of survival, even though we don't, we don't really, most of us especially in the Western world, don't live under survival conditions, and yet we still act like we do, and we still have like fear responses around that, or reactions, I should say. So yeah, I mean, I think it all boils down to fear at the lowest level.
So how did you figure ways to overcome that? Do you have an answer to that? Or not
Yeah,
yet?
I mean, I'm still figuring that out, I guess. So, how to overcome that? I mean, the first thing is to notice it when it's happening, and so if someone were to tell me that I was having these reactions, I would be like, no, I'm not. So I think the first thing is to notice them. But enough people would tell me, I notice you doing this, I notice you doing this. Then after a while, I hear it enough times, and then I do it, and then I'm like, oh, actually, I did do that thing that person told me about, or those 3 people told me about. And so I did just start kind of noticing. And so for me, I'm still at the point, which I think is kind of early on, of recognizing when I'm having some kind of a reaction instead of taking in what's happening and responding appropriately. So I'm still sort of in the observer position, I guess, of trying to see how I act, like watch myself. So I don't know that I'm particularly qualified to tell other people the best way to do this.
Figuring things out.
Exactly, but I will say that observation is helping me a lot to understand myself. So that would be where I would start if I had any advice.
I agree with this one. And so before we wrap up this first part of the interview, because I think it's been already quite a bit of time that we've been talking about these technology topics and these challenges in the world, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about Anarchy, because you mentioned it a little bit earlier. So what's your story with Anarchy? You talked a little bit in the introduction about how you got into it, but can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so the sort of early on realization was the same realization that I think a ton of people have, and maybe even most people, I feel like, look around and they have this sense that things could be better than they are, and that we have really serious problems, and yet we continue to kind of do the same thing every single day, and we don't think about what is it that we're doing that is causing these problems to repeat over and over and over and over again. And to me, I kind of was interested in politics as a kid, a lot because my dad was, and it seemed at the time very clear cut, like there's or at least in an American political sense, there's basically 2 teams. They are roughly opposed, and you kind of would lean to one or the other, and you would kind of pick up on their stories, and you would say, well, if we could do the things that this team is talking about, then yeah, things would be better. And that might even be true on certain levels. But after being continuously disappointed by the team that I chose, I changed teams, and as soon as I changed to the other team, I realized that they actually were basically exactly the same. They were just on opposite sides, and so, well, seemingly opposite sides. Essentially what I mean by that is that they were both making a big to-do about things that were not the root causes of the problems that they were wanting to address or claiming to address. And so after having played for both of the options and stood up for both teams and argued for both sides, I realized that actually neither of them was really doing anything to change the situation of the system that we were in, because they were actually set up to actively protect the system that we live in currently. And so that kind of brought me back to these things that I had read about when I was younger, about like, why do we have to have people telling us what to do at all? The immediate answer is that if you don't have a government, then everything would be chaotic and madness, and people would be killing each other, and all this stuff, and there'd be gangs and all this. But what they never mention is that that's actually the condition that we have now. So we have gangs, we have mass killings, we have wars, we have and most, if not all, of these wars are propagated by those institutions. So it's one thing to have a war for resources. That's kind of the highest culmination of that idea. But they have also these war on drugs, which drugs has been winning ever since that war started. War on cancer, all these different offensives that they're never solving the problem that they set out to set. So for example, the war on drugs, this idea that you can go to war against things that occur naturally is it's really an affront to nature. And that's an ego thing, is that we actually think we can conquer this thing that we don't like the effects of. So we don't like that maybe our kids will go and use some plants that will change their state of mind, and it might cause them to, there's a fear that they'll go crazy, or that they'll turn to crime, or that, all these different things. And so the solution put forward by the government is that, well, why don't we just take anyone that uses these things and put them in a cage, or tell them that they're doing something wrong, tell them that they're bad, like parents. I always noticed that none of that stuff was effective. It wasn't addressing the actual problem. The real problem is that there's a fear around educating young people, maybe in this instance on drugs, about the fact that there are substances in the world that will change the way that you think, and that you can choose not to use them, you can choose to use them, that's your choice. If you choose to use them, there are consequences to using them sometimes, and so you have to have the ability to respond to whatever situation is going to arise if you make that choice. And that applies to every kind of other kind of social issue that the government claims to be able to address. And so, I came to the conclusion after diving into American politics on both sides that actually all the solutions existed outside of this idea of telling someone else what to do, which has no real basis in. It's not any kind of a solution to tell someone else what to do. It's better, in my opinion, to learn what works best, and then help other people to find what works best for them, and to kind of have a co-learning experience, or to assist directly people that come to you because they seek your advice, because they like the example that you're living, for example. It just seems like there's so many different ways to learn together, how to be harmonious, and how to live peacefully, and that the government really doesn't, in general, saying the government is a very broad statement, but and there's so many people that actively work with the best of intentions, and strive towards, in the work that they do, strives towards the same goals that I strive towards. But this monolithic idea of the government, and it seems like the further we've come in the last 100 years, the more of a monolith that becomes, because it used to be you'd have a small regional kind of body of governance, and you can call that a government if you want to, but there was a lot more interaction with the community, and it was the community. And I would guess that the earliest stages of this, there was no central group. It was just everyone made decisions kind of collectively. And then, as trade started to become more broad across regions, there became these ideas of, oh, we need a representative, and so on and so forth. And now we're at the point where the entire globe is now kind of being conglomerated into these, non-governmental organizations and these think tanks, and governments themselves and big corporations are all kind of congealing into this one entity that has completely lost the plot, of the original idea to protect the rights of the men and women in the community, and to strive for the best for everybody. And it's kind of instead got its own agendas and things now, which is, in general, seems to be just that centralization of specifically power, but also resources and money and things of that nature. So a little bit long-winded, but hopefully that answers the question.
That's awesome. And so, do you think? So for me, I have not studied what is anarchy, but whenever I hear about it, I'm like, yeah, I kind of agree with this. Oh, I kind of agree with that. But I don't have a very clear definition of what is anarchy. Mm-hmm. Do you have a clear definition of what it is?
Yeah, so and that's really the best way to explain it, honestly. It's usually where I like to start is with definitions. So it's from the Greek. The prefix an means no or without, and then archons or archos basically means rulers or masters. And so anarchy just means without masters, and the way that I interpret that is just freedom. And the way that anarchy is usually portrayed in the media is as chaos, right? Often you'll see a news report and it'll say anarchy in the streets, and there'll be fires and things of that.
Right.
And that is chaos. But there's actually another term in Greek for that, which is anomi, which means without order, also from Greek. And so what I would really like to see one day in my lifetime is for the media to kind of shift and actually describe things that are happening with the correct terminology. And I think the independent media will pick that up first, of course, and probably the big corporate media and centralized media will probably either obsolete themselves or have to shift radically in the way that they do their reporting.
That's happening.
Yeah.
And so do you think anarchy is a solution to the global control takeover by these big governmental agencies and people in power?
Yeah, I mean, I consider it kind of like a philosophy, a way of living, and, sort of fits into the natural law as well. But I think that it's the natural way and the baseline way, and I think it's the only solution to the problems that we face today, at any rate. I don't think that there's any way that a top-down solution, because, like, if you think about it, let's say you had some perfectly structured global government that was in charge of all resources and everything, and there weren't wars because it was peacefully brought about or what have you, which is, again, a utopian idea, which is usually what I'm accused of. But assuming that could come together, the best case scenario is that you have a small group of people who have to make decisions on behalf of billions and billions of people. And it's just not possible, because you can't possibly, as a small group, understand the needs of everyone on the planet. It's just not possible. And you have your biases and your own culture that you come from, and your own language, and so on and so forth. So I think that the only solution is that we live, the only governing happens over ourselves, and that we understand ourselves and our relationships such that we can live peacefully, and we can trade with each other, and we can do all the things that we want to do, because we can actually understand each other and ourselves as individuals at a very, very deep level, especially in your very closest and most tight-knit relationships and community and family, as opposed to attempting to tell someone on the other side of the world what's best for them and how they should live their lives.
How would that work to coordinate all together, if everyone was living this way, to coordinate the common things? Like, how do we manage the commons, the natural resources and everything in the community that you cannot make? I mean, you could make decisions by yourself or what to do with the resources where you live, but it impacts other people nearby you. So how do you work with that in an anarchist mindset?
So I think that getting that that mindset and that idea of governing yourself and not telling other people what to do is the hard part. And then I think all the other stuff kind of falls in line as a result of that. So, for example, if you take a bunch of humans and you put them on this hypothetical desert island or whatever, currently it would be very likely probably that there would be some desire for leadership, and so a lot of people would probably do not very much, and then a couple of people would probably sort of end up taking the lead and directing people what to do, and maybe they would have power struggles as a result. So whereas if you put a bunch of anarchists on an island, they're generally going to say, okay, I think we should do this, that, and the other, and they'll all kind of look at each other for a minute, and then sort of people will start doing whatever it is that they think needs to be done, and some of those experiments will be failures, and some of them will be successes, and some people will join each other because they realize each other's experiments are more interesting or more successful. This is a good idea for getting food, this is a good idea for collecting water or whatever. And so I think that self-organization is a natural byproduct of the ability to understand that, I don't have any more rights than anyone else, and no one else has more rights than I do. And so there's no reason and no logical, there's no logical conclusion where me telling you how you should do something, unless it's like you're asking me because I have some subject matter expertise, that just doesn't lead anywhere good. It's going to lead to struggle and strife, and it's going to be less efficient in the long run, which is kind of what we're seeing now. We have these ideas of the economy as if it was just one thing, when in reality, there's another term that I like, catalactics, which basically means the interactions between individuals and small groups, which is what the economy is. It's not one thing that can be directed and guided by a few people in a building in one city. It's the result of interactions of everyone with everyone else. And so
more of like a decentralized way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that why you were interested in cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin?
100%. Yeah, because money is this thing that we think about very little, or at least I did at the time. Before 2007, I didn't think a great deal about money. I had some understanding of the Federal Reserve System and how it created money in a centralized fashion and handed it out, and it dictated how that money worked and so on and so forth, and it would generally lose value as a result. I had some notion of this, but then to see the reaction to, first of all, to see that it doesn't actually prevent any of the problems that it claims to prevent, and then second of all, to see the reaction to the problems that occur, it just seemed way worse than a money that we could control as a people instead of a few people controlling the money. And so Bitcoin really got me excited that, oh, this is actually possible. We can create something that we all kind of co-create and we all operate together, and we don't have to trust one small group to have our best interest at heart, or even if they do, to be able to execute on that.
But one question about Bitcoin, and then we can move on to our next topic. I see that it's a good solution, like you say. I agree with you, but at the same time, it's too technical, and I'm not able to manage to understand what are the flaws of it, what are the potential dependencies with other stuff that I don't see because I don't get into the technical aspect of it. But maybe you've studied that. My questions are maybe who controls the nodes? Who maintains it? Because I guess like every software, it needs maintenance to it. So how does that work? And so what if someone decides to just change the whole thing in a different ways, and so it impacts everyone that's using it?
So the reason that Bitcoin was really interesting to me is that it has this sort of checks and balances system to it. Somewhat like we imagine with the American government, except the difference is that anyone can participate in any kind of one of these components of the system. So for example, we have the people who write the code, the developers, who maintain and produce new features, and that one requires the highest degree of technical skill,
Right.
and so there's a little bit of this idea of a kind of a techno-priest class, which can be problematic. However, Anyone can go into the Bitcoin repository and they can look and they can say, well, I don't know how to code, but I do know how to do copy edits, so I can maybe fix typos, or I can write guides that will help people in the future. And those can be added, and then you can become a contributor, and as you become a contributor for something very basic, that will put you in contact with the people that understand it more technically and more deeply, and you can have conversations with them, and you can understand and learn, and then eventually you can learn to program if you choose to go that route, and then contribute code to the project. So that's one group. And then the next group is the people that run the code, and those are the people that run nodes, and that's completely voluntary system as well. It's much easier because you just get the code from the developers as they've created it, and then you run it on your computer. And more recently, a lot of projects have sprung up, including Start9, that allow you to run a Bitcoin node very, very simply in just a few clicks. And so that's getting easy to do. And the important component there is that if the developers of Bitcoin make a change and the people that run the code don't like that change, then they can refuse to run that code. And then that kind of checks the power of the developers. And then there are sort of a few more groups. There's the miners, who are securing the network, creating the blockchain, which contains all the transactions. So they're producing that public ledger, and they are checked by the nodes because the nodes keep a copy of that ledger, and they have to all agree that this is the history all the way back, and that a miner is not trying to produce a block that doesn't conform to the rules that we've already agreed on, which is called consensus. And then there are other kind of ancillary groups, such as merchants, who are willing to accept Bitcoin because they think it's a good money. So if any of the other groups are making changes in a way that they operate such that the merchant doesn't think it's good money, then they're not going to want to accept it. And so it will not have value amongst our species as much in that case. And then there are the people who want to use Bitcoin to purchase things from merchants. Kind of the same thing. They have a desire to use that money instead of the dollar because they see that it has benefits. And there are some others as well, but I think that those are kind of the main groups that kind of form this system where they're kind of constantly watching each other to see, what are they doing, what are they doing, what are they doing? Okay, they're all doing what's expected and what we think is best for the network, so we're going to continue to do our side of it that keeps the whole thing valuable and useful to people that want a global money.
So you think it's safe? You think it's like a good solution, or do you think it's the best solution to build parallel economies, or do you see other ways of getting away from the current system that's not so healthy?
Yeah, I think right now Bitcoin is the best technological money. It is the most well-developed and the most adopted so far. It is the first of its kind. That being said, there's a decades-long history of groups of people that ended up, out of which Bitcoin eventually came, that have been working on other kinds of digital money and global money. And Bitcoin is just basically the first one that really had all the components necessary as far as security, governance in the way that everyone agrees on how it works, and usability, and so on and so forth. And so I think it's the best money that we have right now in the sense of medium of, like a proxy for value. So if we want to make a trade rather than a barter, if we wanted some proxy for that, I think Bitcoin is currently the best. But I think there are a lot of other projects that are, kind of periphery to Bitcoin that use a lot of the same technology as Bitcoin, which are really interesting, which could also, potentially even supplant it. There are a lot of the hardcore Bitcoiners, they really want Bitcoin to be all there is. And I tend to think that there's never...
You're not one of them?
Yeah.
Are you?
Oh, am I? No, I wouldn't say that I'm a maximalist, as they say. I think it's the best right now, but I think, it's hard to say that it's going to be the best forever because there are unsolved problems and there are other ideas around how money might operate, and also I think that there's always going to be more than one kind of money. So I think gold will still be used as value even if Bitcoin were to take over from the US dollar, for example. And I think that water and food are always going to be more valuable than either of those, and so on and so forth. So.
Cool. Well, I think we're gonna stop here and wrap up. And Loki's calling us to go. So, well, thank you very much. And there was many interesting things. I got to understand some stuff that were obscure to me. So that was interesting. Thank you. And yeah, I hope this will inspire people to follow you on this path that you shared. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.